Hi, this is Pastor Luis here. Welcome to the Rhinebeck Reformed Church. We're delighted to be before you through this medium known as YouTube in order to have a moment of spiritual reflection and devotion. We now defer to Bill Murray, who is going to lead us in the reading of scriptures as we explore what God is going to say to each one of us through the powerful miracle story of Jesus walking on the waters.
Today's gospel lesson comes from Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against him. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. Beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat and the wind died down, then those who were in the boat whispered, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Thank you, Bill, for such a faithful and diligent reading of our lesson this morning. Our lesson this morning invites us to ask the following question: do miracles still happen? As people of faith, we say without any equivocation, yes, we believe that miracles still take place today, in part because our faith informs us that God is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And second, one of the things that makes God God is that God cannot be confined to the dimensions of time and space. Therefore, we believe in the miraculous. Jesus once remarked the following words: "Everything is possible for those who believe," leading us to believe that faith is the vehicle that transports us into a life of the miraculous. So having faith is what allows us to be able to experience God's favor and miracles in times in which the impossible may seem to tower over the possible. So let us keep strong in our faith and trust in God. Now, the reading that Bill shared this morning is a miracle story, and it places us at the scene of a lake, one where Jesus violates the rules of physics by walking on water. Talk about the impossible becoming possible. In order for us to appreciate, though, the full scope of the story, it's important for us to begin at the opening verse, where it tells us that Jesus deploys his apostles to meet him on the other side of the lake. They would travel from the eastern side of the lake to the western part of the lake. Nowhere in the story does Jesus reveal to them at what point he was planning to meet them and how he was going to make it from the eastern side of the lake to the western side of the lake. Nonetheless, the apostles complied and they traveled on their own. Now, this opening verse is important for two reasons. This story is written on the heels of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. And for those who are in the caregiving business, the burnout of looking out for the needs of so many people with so limited resources can sometimes make us feel emotionally drained, and that we need some space in order to recalibrate, in order to rejuvenate. And Jesus did that. He went on a hike in order to pray. Prayer and communing with God through nature can quite often provide us with the outlets that we need in order to regain our strength and keep us fresh for the journey that lies ahead. The second reason is that Jesus sends them on their own is because Jesus gives each one of us the emotional and spiritual freedom to face life as life is and to live into our questions. And then when we need Jesus, he will manifest himself and be there for us, especially in those moments in which we feel vulnerable. The gospel story tells us that the apostles were traveling on the lake by boat. Now, this is symbolically an important point. Early on in Christian thinking, this story meant to represent that the water stood for the world, the secular world, the temporal world, and the boat represented the church. God sends us into the world, a world that could be placid and peaceful one moment, and in a flash become stormy and threatening to capsize us, as it did in this story of the apostles. Now, the apostles were traveling when the storm kicks up in an unpredictable manner, and it threatens to capsize them. It's remarkable because these are experienced fishermen. Let us remember that prior to joining the Jesus movement full time, many of them made a living by fishing. So they knew the waters well, they knew how to navigate the boats, they knew how to react in moments in which they may have felt threatened by a storm. But there are storms in life that no matter how well we are prepared, and no matter how much experience and skills we may have, may render us to feel limited and very vulnerable. And the story here suggests that that was the case with the apostles, that the winds pounded their boat in an unrelenting manner, that the waves were roiling and kicking up and threatening to capsize them, and the waters were threatening to pull them down and drown them. Many of us may feel like that at this moment. We may feel that the stress that we are feeling is so immeasurable that we feel that it's going to pull us down. Some of us are grappling with bouts of anxiety or depression, and we feel that it's so strong that we feel we have no way out of this storm that is swirling around us, and that we're going to be pulled down and under. It is at those moments of vulnerability that Jesus appears to rescue them and to remind them that even though he deployed them to go out into the world on their own, he was never indifferent to their plight and to their fate, and that he was going to be there when they needed him the most. There is an adage in Spanish that is appropriate for us to inject into our conversation this morning that goes as follows: Dios aprieta, pero no ahorca. And that adage is best translated as follows: God pinches, but God does not strangle. When we feel that all is lost, when we feel the most vulnerable in our own life, as we face our personal storms, Jesus will appear to deliver us and rescue the day. Now, the apostles, understandably, when Jesus is walking toward them, are so taken up by the stress and by the storm and by the wind that they immediately do not recognize him, and they in fact confuse him for being a ghost. Now, this is understandable. These were people who walked with Jesus and knew him well and just had experienced the miracle of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and yet they had a moment of doubt. So be patient with yourself emotionally and spiritually. If you're feeling right now that you're grappling with doubt, that's okay, because if the apostles had doubt and they walked with Jesus in a very intimate and personal manner, what makes you think that you and I will not have moments of doubt in our own spiritual journey when the storms of life are swirling around us and are threatening to bring us down and under? Now, what Jesus does is very redemptive. He does not scold them for not having faith. He does not judge them for not having faith. He tells them, be of good cheer, it is high. So in those moments in which we feel vulnerable, Jesus does not scold us. He does not belittle our faith or their lack of faith, but he meets us at our point of weakness in order to rescue us and save the day. Now, Peter, upon noticing that it was Jesus, feels emboldened, and he removes himself from the boat, and he begins to miraculously do what Jesus does. He begins to walk on the water. And I think one of the lessons that the apostle Peter is trying to deliver for each one of us, and one of the points that the gospel writer is trying to emphasize, is that when we have faith in Jesus, we can do the miracles that he carried out. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, everything is possible for those who believe. Not only does Jesus walk on water, but also Peter is walking on water. And both of them are walking on the water as if it were a paved Roman road. Now, something happens to Peter along the way. As he is walking, all of a sudden he becomes distracted by the swirling winds and by the roiling waters, and he begins to gradually sink. He feels afraid, and he asks Jesus to save him. Now, Jesus does not scold him, but he extends his hand to him to lift him up and bring them back to safety. There are people in this world who right now are feeling mired in their own distress and perhaps feeling overwhelmed by the winds that are rattling against them and the waves that are beginning to crash upon them, and they feel that as they're sinking. They're sinking as a result of bouts of depression and anxiety. They're sinking as a result of economic distress. They are sinking as a result of many challenges that they face that are real. But in the face of that, like Jesus, we too can extend our hands and help others who are feeling overwhelmed and feel distress. When Peter exclaimed the words, "Save me," these words, as simple as they were, are a form of a prayer. And there are some evocative verses that come from a prayer of Saint Brendan, who is known as the patron saint of sailors. Some of the evocative words that were shared by Brendan, who traveled as a missionary to promote Christianity, are as follows. "Christ of the mysteries, I trust you to be stronger than each storm within me. I will trust in the darkness and know that my times, even now, are in your hand." There are storms that are swirling around us, and there are storms that are swirling inside of us. And in the face of those storms, Jesus is made present to save us and rescue us. So let us not lose hope. Let us not lose our eyes on Jesus. Now, this story also has an important point. At the time in which it was written, Peter is elevated to being the leader of the church. And we know this because Matthew is the only of the gospel writers that tells us that Peter was given the keys of the kingdom. In other words, he had a lot of power to unlock and lock things. So even Peter, a person who was considered to be a paragon of morality, a representation of spirituality at the highest level, has a moment of vulnerability and doubt, and he begins to sink. And I think Matthew is telling us and reminding us that it is not faith in our leaders that will ultimately save us. As much as we may admire our spiritual leaders and think that they walk upon waters, I would remove my shoes and demonstrate to you my dry socks, but the camera angle will not allow me to do that. But irrespective of how elevated of a view that you may have of your spiritual leaders or your elected officials, let us be reminded by this story that putting our eyes or fixing our eyes on Jesus is the ultimate source of our salvation, and only Jesus has the power to not only rescue us like he did with Peter, but to then calm the storms and make everything return to normalcy and peace. So let us remember the question that we started with our conversation. Do you believe in miracles? And I hope that this story inspires us to say yes. No matter what storm we face, Jesus will be there with us. No matter what storm we face, the same Jesus who walked on the waters will rescue us, will also inspire us to walk on the waters like he did to Peter. And when we feel vulnerable, will calm everything around us and lead us to our destination. Amen.
Is built on nothing less weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. He shall come with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. Let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, truly you are Lord of all. We set our eyes of faith on you today. We ask that you would drive away all fear and renew in us your hope. Thank you for your great love and unceasing care for us today. Amen.